Good afternoon and welcome to this week's edition of Halftime Talk. Indeed, a special edition of Halftime Talk. Every month we have a chance to sit down with Christof Rühl, the senior research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University and on the advisory board of Crystal Energy. And it's a great opportunity to sit with Christof and sort of reflect on this very substantial moment that we're sitting in. So thank you, Christof, for joining us.
You're more than welcome. Thanks for having me. And every time you say this, it's a very
Yes, well, every time it's true, I suppose. The I wanted just to pick up on one point that you've been quoted a lot around the media as sort of highlighting as to the sort of understanding as to why markets have been given the scale of this historic moment and most analysis, including your own, the largest disruption in the history of the global oil markets. And yet the oil markets don't seem to be screaming that same headline, or else they're not screaming disruption, largest disruption means much to me these days. But the financial markets are signaling expectations that the war and the disruption will stop before inventories show the strain. Looking sort of backwards, when is that moment? Is that an accurate statement? Are we starting to see strain where headlines appearing that US inventories are half of what their capacity is? Goldman Sachs says we're near a 10-year low on global inventories. When does that strain start to show, or has it started?
So yes, it is start. The alarm bells are ringing all over the place. So first of all, I'm always careful with this claim of largest disruption in history because a disruption is times volume. So we know that volume-wise it was the largest ever, but we don't know about duration yet. So how long it will take. Having said that, what was the saving grace and what explains the muted reaction of oil markets, subsequently of financial markets, was this enormous inventory buffer we had. We had many discussions before that war started where we argued or came to or where I tried to argue at least that supply is larger than consumption, and everybody was trying to guess where is the surplus going. And the biggest of the possible answers was the Chinese strategic storage. We had next to that huge floating storage from sanctioned oil from both Russia and Iran, and earlier also from Venezuela a little bit. And we had next to that pretty well-filled normal stocks in the OECD countries where it's published, and presumably well-filled stocks also in the non-OECD where it's not published. So we had, and the strategic storage was also in good shape. So we had a huge layers of buffers, and it's really like the layers of an onion. How do you draw down inventories? You take the easy to get and the most economic ones first. And the easy to get and most economic ones certainly are in China. Certainly you have to some extent been on the water. And to the official commercial inventories, you come sort of later when that's the last resort. Now, if you have a problem, generally speaking, in economics ever about something which is a puzzle, like the muted reaction of the oil market was a puzzle to many people, the answer usually lies in either inventories or expectations. And here we have the first part of the answers. Inventories were much higher than published, and so the published inventories don't show the strain quite yet. And the second part of the answer lies in the futures curve. You look at forward markets, and you see that prompt markets now are at 110 or something like that, and then it goes down every month until 27. Now, that's not a very good predictor, but it is the aggregate of all market expectations. And clearly, that is part B of the answer. The market expects, as you said, this war and this disruption to pass pretty soon. And if it were to pass right now, I think we would still be on the right side of the Rubicon because there's no physical damage to oil production yet, or not very much. And that would mean that we could go back to normal if it would stop right now. But now, the longer it goes on, of course, the more that disruption becomes more serious.
I mean, one of the things about the historical reference or context is the idea that, obviously the 70s is quite often referenced as the sort of comparable energy shock. But of course, that was like a scale in which, you were literally not eating, you were the scale, that was depression. I mean, that was triggering interest rates to 20%. I mean, it caused my parents' divorce. I think the stress of that crisis at the time was of such a scale. So we don't need to necessarily get to that extreme in order for this to be a crisis, because that was a mega depression crisis. Where are we at now regarding that? Something that is damaging, but maybe not quite heart attack.
The 70s are difficult to compare with today for two reasons. One is it was a period of high inflation, fixed prices, a very different global economy, no emergency storage system, not much inventory holdings. So the system was more vulnerable. And the second is the global economy was much more oil dependent than today. So in the 70s, you needed more than twice as much oil to produce a dollar worth of global GDP than you do now. And many people think that because of this lower oil intensity, the damage today will not be as great. I think it's more tricky than that. You mentioned one keyword coming out of the 70s was depression. So that was a direct hit on global growth. And in our mind, how do these disruptions from oil price increases usually work? One channel, they work through inflation, especially when you have underlying pressure, like in the 70s, the case. And then central banks have to raise interest rates and the system and growth is being hit. The other channel is that they affect growth directly by taking purchasing power away from consumers to stretch the financial system of import-dependent countries to cause problems in their balance of payments. And that hits growth directly. Now, I think we also have a situation where demand needs to adjust, assuming the disruption continues, by 10 is a lot, by 10% of the global market. So prices have to do their job, they have to go up. What I try to work out is the difference between the 70s and now is that I don't see this coming out in a sort of smooth growth going down and in a recession and then a depression as we have seen before. Because what has happened as a result of the economy being so much less oil dependent is that the oil which we still use, especially in the rich countries, is concentrated in high value areas. Everything which can be substituted has been squeezed out over the last 50 years. There's little oil in power generation. There's little people driving around for joyrides. Cars have become incredibly efficient. Planes have become incredibly efficient. But the downside of that is that as oil becomes more concentrated and load-bearing for the economy and occupies whole nodes, if you take it away because you have to lower demand, then you will have unforeseen consequences. There will be ripple effects through the economies. If you take the oil away and a cargo ship cannot drive anymore, supply chain gets disrupted elsewhere. That's very different from replacing oil and power with coal. It's non-substitutable. And this is the risk now, so that we have this normal increase in prices, and then in the poorer countries where there's still a lot of discretionary spending on oil, you will see the people suffering, consumption expenditures being scaled down, and all these effects we know, which will result in lower economic growth. But in the more sophisticated service-based economies, for example, the G7 and including the US, you will see prices shooting up much faster if it comes to that. And then as oil disappears from these strategic locations where it cannot be replaced, there's the threat of unexpected, volatile, and very sudden disruptions cascading through the economy. And that's a crisis, not a depression. There's an old-fashioned distinction, and that crisis is what the problem might be soon.
There's a lot of expectation that, and we've seen it even today when, there's some signal that, some kind of a deal can be done, or each time there's this sort of short-term outlook that this crisis, this war will end, and so some normality will return, and the oil price tends to soften a little bit. But maybe perhaps the scale of the crisis or the market shock that we have not necessarily seen proportionate to a historic disruption, that may still come later, that the expectation that once the Strait of Hormuz opens, that this flow will solve the problem, and perhaps over time it will. But before it solves the problem, we will finally have the big problem, because the expectation of solution will not meet the reality. The expectation at the moment is day one, you turn on the switch, your lights in your room go on. But in this case, you turn on the switch, the lights don't come on straight away. And the demand will be massive, not only for today, but also tomorrow, rebuilding in inventories. Your thoughts of the day after that, the expectation that this solves quickly versus the reality, and that's where we could see the price shock.
So the answer to this is actually, I think, a pretty clear-cut picture. The answer lies in what exactly happens at the Strait of Hormuz. If it would return to normal, by normal I meant the status quo ante, so no Iranian control anymore, expectations would be that oil markets will adjust, and just maybe a little bit more gradual, not next Tuesday, but over the next few weeks and months. And these expectations would be correct. That is the picture which we see in the forward curve still today. There's no sort of expectation that's on the 17th of May it will be over, but there's an expectation that over the next year or so it will gradually return to normal. The other is that some solution will be announced, which is not credible. So that doesn't really open in the sense of going back to what it was before. That Mr. Trump goes home and declares victory. He seems to really sort of prepare to do this. He's nervous and all of that. And that markets will start to believe it or not believe it. Then what you will see is that oil prices continue to be very volatile. And the ups and downs will be driven by the daily drip feeding of a ship has passed, a ship has not passed, there was a clash, there was no clash, and it will not, meaningfully fall back towards 60 or wherever it belongs with an oversupplied market. And the third scenario, but let me give you the third one.
Yeah.
Third one too is that nothing happens, and Iran maintains control and exercises it, and it becomes clear the disruption will last. Once markets are convinced of that, prices have ample space to shoot up because of this lack of oil in the global economy, of this lower intensity. I give you just one number. If to take a price of $115 today, that would be the equivalent to $339 in the year 1980 after the Iranian Revolution, because largely not only inflation, but also because of this improvement in oil efficiency. So we have ample runway. And what would happen then is that at some point, when official inventories are visibly going down and it's clear the end of the line gets closer, prices will shoot up, and that will most likely create this kind of crisis, not long-term depression, not gradual recession, this time of serious crisis, which I was referring to, where you see ripple effect in the economy and then the dominoes falling all over the place. That would be a true disaster scenario.
If you take the idea of going back to normal, even if you take the idea of flow through the Strait of Hormuz, where there's no toll booth and no policeman, if you're whatever, but the world doesn't go back to what it was, does it? I mean, when you think about it from an oil markets, oil demand, oil consumption point of view, my sense is that probably the biggest legacy from that channel is we move away from, and perhaps back to, when we're sort of talking 1970s or former models, that we're going to see the end of the just-in-time delivery economy and move towards the build up your inventory, stockpile, hoarding, national frameworks, all of that being a lot more energy intensive, a lot more capital intensive, and with that, a greater pull on the limited hydrocarbon resources that there exist. Where do you see some of, regardless of the politics around the Strait of Hormuz, some of possibly irreversible economic changes?
I think you're exactly right. It is going to express itself into increasing economic fragmentation, which is already, instead of globalization, which is already in train. On oil markets, we will see more pipelines being built, attempts at diversification and all of this. In energy markets, we probably can't see very much other than better infrastructure, because it will not trigger a return to the energy transition, because renewables can't be stored and have their own supply problems, as we found out as Europe found out after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So that there will be no big shifts. The real shift will come in the global economy, in this tendency which we already have towards fragmentation, towards walking away from globalization. We had COVID demonstrating how fragile supply chains are. We had this whole episode with tariffs threatening global integration even more, and it would go into that direction, the medium-term effects. And that is, also, of course, the opposite of increasing efficiency and the opposite of a decent international division of labor and a step back in the potential for economic growth. I agree with that.
I've just been in this week, and it's still going on actually, the Make It in the Emirates it's more than a campaign now, it's a whole industry, but and it's been around for a few years. The idea of sort of developing a supply chain, attracting manufacturing into the local market here, which was sort of its foundation. But now this year, and in the context of the current crisis, it has resonated on a whole nother level of domestic supply chain for everything in order to have resilience in these times. And obviously, the UAE won't be unique in that. That sense of domestic resilience will be critical front and center, not just energy security, but other elements as well, like countries can't get sulfur right now. They can't get fertilizer. They can't get. So this idea of resilience and building that infrastructure into as much as one can in the economic format. How does that play out, do you think, both short, medium term, in terms of energy demand?
It makes the economic pie smaller. It makes the growth of the global economic pie much slower, and therefore it will negative impact demand. But I'm one probably doesn't have to be so pessimistic over the longer term because it will very fast be very obvious that this is not an efficient way to go. It reminds me of a discussion we had around and after the First World War about autarky in food production when a lot of people said, okay, in order to protect us against these shocks of wars and crazy politicians and all the rest of it, we need to be autark in terms of food. We cannot rely on trade, to feed our people. That is an idea everybody today would laugh right out of the door because it is so obviously very inefficient and so obviously it would get to the detriment of consumers who had to stop eating oranges in Abu Dhabi to stay in the picture. And I think it is on a smaller scale perhaps, but it will create a backlash. There are attempts at integration from the European Union to the Mercosur trade arrangements, which hopefully will be shaken a little bit back to life and into activity. There's also something else in the political realm. There's a silence of all these people who want more integration, who want globalization, and they have been silenced, of course, by the powers that be because they made a lot of mistakes and they underestimated the economic costs for the normal population and they allowed this huge gap between the super rich and the rest of us to grow and grow and grow until resentment was large enough to vote for Trump and Farage and you name it. And the hope is that as their economic model falters at great expense, unnecessary expense to all of us probably, but as it falters, as it will, that the world sort of returns a little bit back to normal, like to the 60s and 70s with high growth, with integration, but without these enormous divisions of wealth.
I just wanted to wrap up, Christof, with your thoughts on the decision by the UAE to leave OPEC, and from the point of view of the current moment in time, there, you hear in the week that since the news was announced, oh, the UAE is going to produce, unrestricted, produce as much as they can. Obviously, their capacity is closer to 5 million than it is to the 3.5 million of their former OPEC quota. But it seems to me every oil producer on the planet is going to produce at full capacity coming out of this crisis because the demand is going to be so significant. And you still going to have producers like Iraq and Kuwait who are currently shut in. What's your sense of the journey in the assumption that there's no restrictions on anybody in terms of oil production moving forward out of this crisis? What does that look like to you and from a market sort of pricing point of view?
We have to realize that there are no permanent crises, as Karl Marx used to say. And so this will pass at some point. On the UAE's exit from OPEC, I've said this many times, and I want to be clear. I don't know whether this was a deliberate strategy. There's, first of all, in the short term, all sorts of theories which all may have played a role, being hit harder than anybody else by Israel from Iran, being unhappy with the relationship with the big neighbor for a whole variety of reasons, having built up huge capacity and not being able to use it, and so on and so forth. But there is a change, a long run change in oil markets, which will reassert itself, I believe, after this crisis has blown over. And that is the tendency towards oil demand to plateau off or to even to peak gently. And by most estimates, before this crisis started, that was to be happening in the next decade or so. And I would share that sentiment. That's a serious probability, at least. And what do you do if the market suddenly starts shrinking, a market which has always in its history been growing? In order to maintain the same production and export levels as an oil producer, you need, by definition, in a shrinking market, to increase your market share. How do you do that? By price competition with other producers. If that happens, if we see peak oil, it will result in a race or a slow walk, whatever it is, to the bottom, to lower prices, as people start to compete for market share. And the higher prices will be priced out. The low-cost producers will be king in that game. There is no possibility that a cartel, which is not a monopoly because they cover only 40% of the global market, can protect its members from this downward trend. And there's no chance that members, especially those who are the lowest cost producers, will suffer the most. The Kuwait, the UAE, Saudi Arabia. And that will put pressure on the cartel and probably lead to its breakup in due course. Now, I'm not saying that the UAE shares that view and therefore took this decision. But whether they know it or not, strategically, it is the decision which exactly plays in that kind of scenario. It puts them in a position to start that race at full capacity, to bring production forward and to get market share back in terms of volumes, which they and everybody else may lose in terms of the
I suppose there's few countries in the world in the context of their position that had such a significant amount of idle capacity in the incremental pieces here and there, and obviously Saudi Arabia. But that ability
Yeah, but
to
now you tell me why they're all sitting among OPEC members of the GCC. And I think maybe they know something which we haven't known. It's amazing to me. We had discussed this before the war many times, but now it's completely gone from the discussion. Everybody just focuses on this supply disruption, maybe rightly so. But if you think of the months and years after that crisis is over, which it eventually will, the issue of having higher production than consumption will not only be back on the agenda, if what we have said about global economy, the reaction of the global economy, it will be back on the agenda with a vengeance.
But I do think in that regard that we obviously have run out of time now. But ultimately, I think the period we're going into, it would seem to me, is going to be full of extra demand. I mean, if you take the models of they were talking about this supply decision that the UAE has taken, but if you look at the demand decision that China has taken in the recent years to build over 150 to 200 days of import cover, it's a doubling nearly of the OECD, and every other country that has. I mean, India hasn't even got storage capacity of note, and I would think there's these new layers of demand based on energy security that will be quite profound.
Yes, that's right. But it will be it's like refilling buffers. It improves elasticity in the system. And for a while, as you said, it will increase demand. And you probably should share non-oil producing emerging market stocks now. But once it's full, whatever the new desired level of forward
Yeah.
cover is, you will have an even stronger effect on normalization.
Listen, we're going to have to wrap it up there. It's going to be a fascinating week. And we didn't even mention that next week, the Donald Trump and Xi Jinping will have their first summit in Beijing, the first summit of Trump's second term, which could point some direction to all of these issues, including the outcome of the crisis here in the Gulf. Let's hope it is some sort of catalyst to a solution, because we can't seem to find it anywhere else at the moment. Christof Rühl, Senior Research Scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks for doing this and thanks for inviting me.